Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I am the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome today to the virtual reading group. We are reading a collection of her essays, Essays in Understanding, and it's somewhat of a chronological collection, although it skips some. And we're in this period of 1945-46, right after the war. Arendt has been in the United States for 4 to 5 years. And here she is reviewing a German novel, the Tod Virgils, The Death of Virgil, by Hermann Broch, as well as commenting largely on German philosophy in the essay, What is Existential Philosophy, and then reviewing some works of recent French existential philosophy. This is how she's making a living. I mean, I guess I just want to keep saying this. She makes a living in this period by doing reviews. She's a feuilleton. She's a cultural writer. She has not yet published a book in the United States that has given her any name yet. And so these essays are book reviews, all three of them, and we should keep that in mind as we go forward. So the first essay or book review, No Longer and Not Yet, is a review of The Death of Virgil by Hermann Broch. She calls The Death of Virgil at one point the greatest poetic achievement of the age since Kafka's death. It's pretty extraordinary praise, and it is a book for her that, as you can see, plays an important role. It is, in a way, the bridge between, as she says, Proust and Kafka in the modern age. Hermann Broch lived from 1886 to 1951. He and Arendt became friendly after they both came to New York. They have enormous correspondence, correspondence. Arendt later wrote the introduction to Broch's collected works, which we read a few months ago, those of you who were in the group then, that was published in her book, Men in Dark Times. And in that collection, in that essay, she says that Broch was a brilliant literary writer, artist, but a less gifted philosopher, and that he made a switch in his life from literature to philosophy, and that was for the loss. She wasn't thrilled with his philosophy. But the height of his literary excellence is in this book, The Death of Virgil, and the theme here, as some of you have already pointed out, including Paul in the chat, is this mantra: no longer and not yet. This is actually a quote from The Death of Virgil, although I don't think she ever says that in the essay. It's repeated in almost every paragraph of the review. It is, in many ways, if we want to understand what Arendt found so meaningful and so powerful about this book, which again is she says the greatest poetic achievement of the age since Kafka, we have to understand what she meant by this no longer, not yet. And so we can read the first few lines where she really lays it out. And she says that David Hume, once remarked that the whole of human civilization depends upon the fact that one generation does not go off the stage at once and another succeed, as is the case with silkworms and butterflies. So usually there's a continuity. It's not like a radical break. So remember, she's writing this in 1946. 17 years later, in 1963, she's going to write her book On Revolution. And On Revolution is about what it means, what are those moments when human civilization, when one generation breaks from another and there's a real revolution. And here she's already thinking about that with this idea of no longer and not yet, and with Virgil. This is an idea that is going to continually return in her work. And what she means here is that at some turning points of history, she writes, at some heights of crisis, a fate similar to that of silkworms and butterflies may befall a generation of men, namely that they may shed their skin and transform. A revolution can happen. For the decline of the old and the birth of the new is not necessarily an affair of continuity between the generations, between those who for some reason or another still belong to the old and those who neither feel the catastrophe in their bones or have already grown up with it. The chain is broken, and an empty space, a kind of historical no man's land, comes to the surface, which can be described only in terms of no longer and not yet. And so this no longer and not yet is another word for the revolutionary situation that we've talked about so much and that Arendt talks about so much in her work, namely the revolutionary situation in which the old institutions, the authorities, the fact that the institutions and authorities that we encounter have lost their ability to motivate us, have lost their authority. Authority is no longer. That's the no longer. What's the not yet? It's that we have not yet inaugurated a new idea. The revolution hasn't happened. I mean, think about, what so many people are seeing today on both left and right. The anger and resentment going on is very much an expression of the no longer, an expression of the fact that we no longer accord our institutions, our establishments, our artistic institutions, our academic institutions, our political institutions, our economic institutions, we no longer accord them the kind of authority that would allow us to live in them as a living world. There's a kind of abyss that has opened up. And yet the fact that we're still in this no longer is because she says we haven't yet figured out we haven't had a revolution. We haven't, there are a lot of people calling for revolutions on the left and the right, by the way. What they haven't done, according to Arendt's analysis, again, she's dead, 50 years. We're not talking about her, but according to her analysis, what they haven't yet done is articulate a new reality that would allow for the revolution in freedom and a new establishment of authority to emerge. And Arendt is what she says always is that the problem today is that we are in a revolutionary situation without any real revolutionaries. Yeah, we have people fighting. They know what they don't like. They know what they're fighting against. But what we haven't yet had are people who can articulate what it is that we are collectively fighting for. And that's the difference between the no longer and not yet and what would actually be a revolution. And so for her, the death of Virgil and Hermann Broch are a brilliant and deeply poetic articulation of this abyss, of this space, this bridge time in between, in which the old is dead. We know that, but the new has not yet been born. She says this largely has its beginning post-World War I, so 1914 some odd forward. And honestly, I think what we can say is that from 1914 until now, we've largely been living in this no longer, not yet. This is a long period of what I think we can call a revolutionary situation. There's been constant recognition by many groups and in many societies that our institutions have no credibility and no authority. There's been, after World War II, there was certainly a return to them out of a feeling of fear and necessity. But over and again, we've seen those institutions fail to establish themselves as authority, and the rise of a feeling of homelessness and meaninglessness. But what we haven't seen is a new world born, and that's the problem that Arendt sees in Virgil. That is also the problem that she sees as the fundamental place of philosophy in the modern age. Now, remember, she doesn't think of herself as a philosopher. As she says in the first essay of this volume, the interview with Günter Gauss, she denies being a philosopher. But she is trained in philosophy, and in the essay, What is Existential Philosophy? It is, in a sense, a long meditation on the no longer and not yet. The premise of this essay is that, which is written again it was written in 1946. It was published in the Partisan Review in 1946 in English, translated from German, and published then 2 years later in a book called Six Essays in Germany. But the premise here is that we have moved from being to existence in philosophy. Okay, what does that mean? Most simply, for her, and she takes this from her teacher, Martin Heidegger, the entire history of philosophy is a history of reflection on the basic sentence from Parmenides, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. And the sentence in Greek is togar auto esti noen teke einai, which in English is that the same are thinking and to be. Being and thinking are the same. What does that mean? It means that for anything to be, it has to be thought. Namely, all things that are, all existing things, are part of a thoughtful, rational universe. It's a fundamental idealism, if you want to think of it in that way. And so all of thinking, philosophy, is about trying to understand what is within a logical, coherent, thoughtful system. Logical, not necessarily, but a thoughtful system. The last person to really believe this as a philosopher and articulate it in a great way was Hegel, who tried, amidst the failure of this and the rise of science, tries to save the unity of being and thinking, the harmony, to reconcile thinking and being, and his famous phrase, which Arendt takes to be sort of the core Hegelian insight, and it actually appears in almost every book she ever published, is that the real is the ideal. Namely, the real is rational. That what Hegel's project is to show that everything that is actually part of a rational thought universe, and that it proceeds historically over time. And thus, and here's one of her problems with Hegel, there is no freedom. We are, in our freedom, we are actually determined as part of a rational system. All modern philosophy, namely post-Hegelian philosophy, is for Arendt a rejection or a reaction to the failure of Hegel to systematize, to make being rational in the modern world. And then she goes through 4 examples of that. The first is Husserl. Husserl is often considered to be the beginning of phenomenology, and the motto of phenomenology is to the things themselves. What does that mean? She says that in some ways it's it's simply a rejection of systems, a rejection of concepts, a rejection of the idea that we will that the way to understand real things is by understanding them rationally through a kind of thought system. And yet, she says, even though that's the sort of core insight, Husserl himself forgets it. In fact, he's insightful enough to know that we have to go to the things themselves, that we can't have a system. But he wants somehow to reanimate the magic and turn this individual thing that we go to ourselves into something positive, into something that can build a new system of knowledge. And the way he does that is through this intentional structure of consciousness. I'm not going to go into Husserlian philosophy. Suffice it to say that for Arendt, the brilliance of Husserl is to focus on the individual, the thing itself. The failure of Husserl is that he then seeks to reinstitute a kind of magic that reincorporates the thing itself into a universalist project. The second philosopher she talks about is Kant. Now, Kant obviously wrote before Hegel. If you want to understand the thinking here, is that Hegel is actually a response to Kant. So for Arendt, Kant is really the first great thinker of the problem of the failure of the unity of being and thought. Hegel is an attempt to salvage that unity in a post-Kantian way. And so here's the problem. And I think if you can understand the Kantian section, then you understand the core of this essay, because the essay is really about a problem more than it is about the solution. The problem is that Kant is the destroyer of the old world, the insight of Parmenides, of the unity of thought and being, that they are the same. Modern philosophy begins, Arendt says, with the realization that the what. Now, what is the what? The what is, if you look at me, Roger Berkowitz, what is Roger Berkowitz? Well, you would have to investigate scientifically who I am, where I come from, both, biologically, but also spiritually and intellectually, economically, whatever. And you would try and place me in the context of the genesis of who I am through all those causes, and try to know me through that. So this is the what. And the insight that Kant has is that in trying to understand a thing, an individual, you'll never be able to explain the that, its givenness, the mere fact that it is. What Kant rejects is that I, as an individual, can ever know a thing in itself, das Ding an sich, in a way that I have full knowledge of it. I simply don't have that. I'm a limited being. And so this is the rejection of the scientific idea that man can know things of the world with truth. This means that we realize that the real world, the real things are empty. The Ding an sich is an empty thing. We can never know it. We have no essence that can explain things' existence. Thus, thinking and being part company, and we turn away from science. And so existentialism for her is a rejection of the scientific idea that we can know beings and know things. In Descartes' words, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, it doesn't actually show that I am. All it shows is that something thinks, but not that this thinking being is. The way Kant explains this is to disprove Saint Anselm's ontological proof of God. This is a bit inside baseball philosophy, but I think it's helpful, so I'm going to do it for a second. For those of you who don't know, Saint Anselm was a Christian philosopher who offered a proof of God that was held to be true for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the first person to philosophically refute it was Immanuel Kant. And the ontological proof of God is very simple. It says, God is a perfect being, right? It's just a definition of God. He's the most perfect being. That's the major premise. The minor premise is all perfect beings exist because perfection includes everything. It must include existence. Therefore, since God is a perfect being, all perfect beings exist, God exists. This was an irrefutable proof for hundreds of years. And Kant refutes it with one sentence. And the sentence is, Sein ist kein reales Prädikat, or being is not a real predicate. So the problem here is with the minor premise, namely that God is a perfect being. What's the problem? The word is. Why is that the problem? Because is a predicate. And to say God is a perfect being says that God exists, which actually was what the whole proof was supposed to prove. And so what Kant says is by saying God is a perfect being, we've already assumed what we were trying to prove, namely that God exists. Similarly, when Descartes says all beings who think are, man is a being who thinks, therefore man exists, that is the same problem. The point is that you say man is a being who thinks, you're already saying man is, and for Kant, Descartes can't prove that. Thus, man is cut off from the absolute. His being and his thinking are separate, and he is radically alone, abandoned. And this is her account of how Kant presents the problem of the separation of existence and essence that all modern philosophies an attempt to deal with. She then talks about the sort of three most well-known modern existential philosophers: Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Jaspers. I've talked for a long time. I don't want to go too far into it. Let me say that with Kierkegaard, the point is that the individual is in constant contradiction to the explained world, namely his being is different from his thinking. His existence is his being, and that he is thus a self, and that the point is to become myself outside of any systems. Heidegger is the closest to Kant in some way. It is an attempt to think the ruin of the identity of being and thinking that it is lost. And Jaspers, Arendt's other teacher, is for her the real model of what existence philosophy is. And in many ways, here is her attempt through Jaspers to describe what she's going to do in her work. What Jaspers does is he confronts what she calls these border situations: death, guilt, fate, chance. And these situations show us to be alone, to be cut off from any Hegelian system, from any Husserlian intentional consciousness. And what they do is leave us amidst a kind of questioning. We are lost. There's a kind of perpetual agitation or a perpetual appeal. But unlike Heidegger, where the perpetual appeal is where I appeal to being, to some almost mystical connection to some being in a conversation with myself, for Jaspers, I appeal to others. And thus, he appeals to action and to communication, and that existence can only emerge in this acting with and talking to others. And this will become Arendt's own view. The French Existentialism essay, published in The Nation in 1946, is a continuation in a way. It looks at the two great French existentialists, Camus and Sartre. And it says that what unites them and what unites French existentialism are two ideas. The first is the spirit of seriousness, namely, the rejection of the spirit of seriousness, the rejection of the idea that we play a role. So I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a teacher, I'm a student, I'm a citizen, and that I'm supposed to take on these roles. And yet in doing so, I lose my freedom. I lose that abandonment, that sense that I am cut off. And thus I do exactly what Arendt says we lose our freedom, in the sense that we assume that we are less free than we are because we have to play this role. And both Sartre and Camus say that instead of this seriousness of taking up a role, we should play, and we should be an actor and let ourselves be whoever we want. And the corollary of that, the second part of that, is that we thus refuse to accept the world as it is. We refuse to accept the roles of the world. We embrace our basic homelessness and this condition of absurdity. She doesn't find in them any answers, but she thinks that to a certain extent that they take up these positions, they again offer up an indication of the problem we are in. Again, the problem for all of these three essays, the No Longer and Not Yet, and then the two existentialist essays, is the loss of the old, the breakdown of the old, the breakdown of the metaphysical system, her rejection of the idea that there is something like a metaphysical system, and in reaction to that, a sense that we are in this no man's land, this bridgeless abyss. And all of these thinkers in their own way are trying to address this. All right, I'll stop there and open it up for questions. First question is from Anne Skolnick. Hi, Anne. Can you unmute yourself and ask a question? Anne, are you there? All right, Dina, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
As we're sort of, well, aren't we always already in between the no longer and the not yet, even as we're awaiting a revolutionary who's going to articulate a common cause, so that even as that happens, we'll also be in the no longer, between the no longer and the not yet. It's not that a revolutionary is a savior or leads us to salvation.
Well, it depends who the we is in your question. Post 1914, generally the answer is yes, although with some caveats. Even, I mean, so to make it easy, prior to 1914, Arendt thinks that there is again, there's moments of revolution and moments of breakdown, but for most of world history, there are strong authorities, political, cultural, religious, academic, scientific, whatever it is, that have authority, and most people obey not because they are forced to, but because they think they're right. So in the Greek period, from Homer until Socrates, there was largely a strong sense of what to be Greek meant. The rise of Socrates is actually read rightly by Nietzsche, according to Arendt, as the beginning of the end of that, where Socrates begins to question the Athenian consensus and the Athenian authority, and that's when philosophy emerges. But then in Rome, and with the rise of Rome and then Christianity, you see, a 1700 year reign of a traditional system in the West that is largely accepted as authority for 1600 years. Now, again, there are exceptions, and there are times when it's stronger and times when it's weaker, but it's largely there. She thinks that the real time when that breaks is it starts to break fully in 1914, and then fundamentally breaks with the concentration camps, which she thinks are simply the absolute experiential break of that tradition. In our own time, since then, largely we've been in a world without authority. And yet, look at the 1950s in the West. It was a pretty conservative, largely non-revolutionary time where people, I think, somewhat in reaction to the World War II, reaffirmed, let's call them Judeo-Christian religious moral values and kind of bourgeois mentality. Not because they really believed in them, if you take Arendt's analysis, but because they were terrified of the opposite and their breakdown. And then the 60s restarted the awareness of that breakdown. So yeah, there are times, I think, when we are more and more aware of the abyss, the no longer and not yet. And there are times when we are less aware of it. I mean, until 3 or 4 years ago, I think many people felt pretty confident that things were stable. I could be wrong, but I think some people did. I think 3 years later, there's very little of that confidence. The 1980s were quite different from the 1960s, just to put it in another way. Is that, you want to follow up or challenge that?
A little bit, if I may.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think it explains the role of authority and tradition in her mind, and how that's susceptible to change over time and so forth, and the loss of the value of what authority and facts can give us and so forth. But I think that the role of Socrates in her work is very illuminating. She talks a lot about him, and he represents him.
Role of what, Dina?
Of Socrates.
Socrates.
And his role is, as you said, that the recognition of the essential abyss, right? This not yet and no longer, in his questioning. I mean, he represents that almost in human form.
Absolutely. So let me say, I mean, look, there are different epochs in world history, and there are periods in which things are really unsettled, and the no longer and not yet comes to the fore, right? Socrates was a period where the Greek consensus, if you will, was clearly crumbling, and he was a representative of that. But then Rome emerged, and you had a millennia plus of a fairly static traditional system in the West. I'm not, we have to look elsewhere, talk other ways in other places. What Arendt says in her essay, I think it's What is Authority? What she says is philosophers live in the no longer and not yet almost at all times. But most other people at most times live amidst authority. What's unique about the 20th century and now the 21st century, from her perspective, is that not only philosophers live without banisters or without authority, but everybody is aware that those banisters and those authorities are gone. There was always a few who would question the authority at any given time, but it wasn't a general recognition. And what is distinctive of the modern period is that pretty much everybody knows that this is happening. If that helps. I don't know if I think I tried to answer your question about Socrates, but maybe go one more time because you look dissatisfied, Dina.
No, I think that the essay or the discussion about Jaspers is in some ways an extension of a discussion about Socrates, in the sense that for Jaspers, as far as I understand it, based on Arendt's reading of him, that philosophical posture you were just speaking of is what we're left with.
Yes, I mean, Jaspers, and she sees Jaspers and Socrates as as two of the great philosophers of thinking as conversation. And insofar as she sees Jaspers and Socrates as philosophers of conversation, she sees them as of a kind. Obviously, there's going to be major differences, but I think you're right. I mean, of all the modern philosophers, Jaspers is the closest to Socrates because of his conversational aspect. I mean, I have a law degree, some of you know, and I teach legal courses. And one of the things I do is I use the Socratic method, which is that method in which you don't ever say anything. You simply ask questions as a teacher, and you try and lead them along. It's called the maieutic method, the idea of sort of giving birth. And you sort of coach the people to give birth to their own ideas rather than telling them what you want them to think. But what she says is that even Socrates used the Socratic method, this maieutic method, as a very he was in charge. He was directing the conversation, and as he says a number of times, it's a very violent method because if people go the wrong direction, he has to sort of ask questions that pull them back in the right direction. She says Jaspers even is more conversational and less directive than Socrates, because it's purely about conversation. There's no director. There's no person directing the conversation. High praise for Jaspers from her. Okay? I don't know if I can do much more, but
thank you.
Anne, are you back yet? I don't know if I know you had a question. You have your hand raised, but I don't know if you're still here. Anne? Seems not. Anne? All right, Paul.
Okay, so I think I want to suggest that the not yet is actually pretty much in view, that we can make it out, and that we are in a moment that requires shedding something that Hannah Arendt herself did not shed successfully. I think if she had lived a little longer, it would have gone. That is the normalizing of domination, and I mean specifically the reduction of human beings to objects of use. That is part of an idea of freedom, that you cannot have freedom except on the backs of slaves. That in turn is a very old alienation. It's there in Genesis, where the Jews can remember that once upon a time they were not alienated, that life was good, that life on earth was good, that there was a benevolent creator whose benevolence was visible in the creation. But it's a remote memory now, because you're reading the account of people who have been enslaved in Egypt. So that, it seems to me, is really crucial. And if you think about just American history, it really has this split identity, right? We inherit two wildly incompatible legacies. One is the legacy of a democracy that is local and participatory, that elevates and relates human beings in the exercise of freedom, in deciding together the terms under which they will live. But the other is colonial domination, with legacies like slavery, indentured servitude, the assumption that people who are not of independent means are incapable of directing their own energies, And we just have this normalization of domination in America for a very long time. So I think,
Paul,
reality right this very minute
all right,
is calling our attention to the need for non-violent relationships with our fellow human beings and with the rest of life on Earth.
okay.
And it is not hard to see it.
Yeah. So I take it to be the premise of your claim that we're shedding the normalization of domination, at least from an Arendtian perspective. The premise is that we are going to have robots and automatons that will do the work for us. Otherwise, from at least there's because for her, there's a fundamental distinction between necessity and freedom. We need necessities, and yet the need for necessities requires that we do work that is necessity and not free, and thus that we either do it ourselves and thus sacrifice our own freedom, or we have other people do it for us. We dominate them and then establish our freedom on their backs. She considers quite at length in the book The Human Condition whether the rise of automation would enable the overcoming of the need for these kinds of relations of domination. She certainly considers it. She raises it. She doesn't think it will. But outside of that, doesn't seem to be much prospect for shedding the normalization of domination.
The automation has nothing to do with it. That's the whole point. When I said Arendt did not shed this, she did not get quite there.
I don't understand it, regardless. So it's hard for me to know what you're talking about.
The perfect place to look, there's a letter of Benjamin Franklin's describing the Iroquois, in which he describes how the amount of time they spend meeting the material needs of their lives is so much less. And, they do it through cooperative effort, and they do it really with this sort of masterful efficiency because they know the natural world of which they are a part and don't regard it as some alien place.
Yeah. So all I'll say is that's, look, there's a whole lot of 17th, 18th century romanticization of Iroquois and primitive cultures. There were a lot of people who said they're not violent. They are peaceful. Obviously this was all wrong. These were, again, not to say bad, but very violent, very warlike cultures. Again, that's not a negative. It's just a fact. I certainly see no evidence that we are on the verge of somehow shedding domination and returning to a kind of minimalist utopia in the world. I just don't see any evidence of that anywhere in the world right now. I see the opposite. Not sure what to make of that.
I think this is a very strange discussion. I'm sorry to intervene, but you see, one of the last meetings, we talked about the right and the left as this was CNN and Fox News. And that was the parameters of right and left. But for instance, if you can at least contemplate non-capitalist modes of production, then it might be possible to at least have a not yet, another possibility which we can't realize. But I think you're being a bit closing down the possibility of an imagination in which the extraction of surplus labor and alienation is the only form of existence which can be conceived. And unless we can conceive non-capitalist modes of production, even if they cannot be realized in our lifetime, then we really have given up. And I think without realizing it, you put a sort of barrier in your mind around a form of thinking which doesn't assume capitalist enslavement.
Okay. It's possible I do, both David and Paul. I will be the first to admit I'm skeptical of utopianism in these regards. And certainly the historical attempts at them throughout the 20th and even into the 21st century have not gone well. I am not going to preclude it, but I certainly, all I can say is, at least where it's been tried, it has led to more domination and enslavement than capitalism has. Which is not to say I'm defending capitalism. It's just that's how I don't see it happening. But I hope it would. I don't know what else to say on that. I don't want to get into my views on this per se. Certainly, Arendt didn't see that kind of turn happening, as Paul rightly pointed out. If it is going to happen, I'd have to be told where and how. I think there are, anyway, I think we've, for 200 years, people have been arguing that the not yet is going to be a kind of socialist, non-capitalist utopia. For 200 years, that hasn't happened. Arendt's view, right, is that you're probably going to have to try another idea. It's not just going to happen suddenly, and we need a new idea. I think I'm pretty confident that her view, I'm just trying to articulate which is her view, which she never states 100%, so I'll just say I'm pretty confident this is her view, is that one of the reasons we have not had a revolution for the last 100 years is that the left has been stuck in a communist, socialist mode that has over and again failed, and that as a result is no longer able to inspire the majority of the people. And that until the left accepts that and comes up with new ideas, it's not going to succeed. I take that to be her point. Whether we agree with her or not is a different question. If you guys want to continue it, just raise your hands again. I'm going to move on for now, though. Margaret, you're up next.
Hi, I have a very specific question about the notes of the second piece. She goes into, and she's talking about Heidegger, and she goes into, his entry into the Nazi Party. And then in the second paragraph of note 2 on page 187, she says, in view of the truly comic aspect of this development, and in view of the no less genuinely abysmal state of political thought in German universities, one is tempted simply to dismiss the whole business. So, comic in the sense of Samuel Beckett? I mean, otherwise I don't understand how this is comic. And it threw me because I thought there was something, I mean, either it's comic in an absurdist sense and in keeping with the other pieces we read, or there's some sort of weird disdain of this is a part of the story I don't like, so I'm just going to dismiss it, which seems a little facile. Or there's something else that I'm missing entirely. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Look, Arendt on Heidegger is always complicated. You know, she writes two other essays on Heidegger. One is in this book, Heidegger the Fox, short, and then a longer one, Heidegger at 80, which I think we read in the collection, Thinking Without a Banister, the second edition of this, second volume of this book. And in that book, she has a footnote where she responds to a graduate student and says, you know, don't take everything I said about Heidegger in this essay, What is Existential Philosophy, so seriously. You know, I was sort of angry at him. You know, and this is, remember, she hasn't yet seen Heidegger since they had an affair and he abandoned her and he abandoned Jaspers. And she's largely very angry at Heidegger at this point in her life. I think she sees him sort of as a fool, or she presents him as a fool in this essay to some degree. And so, yeah, I think she's to some degree making fun of him. And that's the comic aspect that she's talking about. I mean, I think she still thinks he's a great thinker at this point, but I think she is trying to distance herself from him. I mean, you have to remember two things. One is she studied with him, and so to some degree she's worried she's associated with him. And two, nobody knows this, but she was his lover, right? I mean, at this point in 1946, it's not known.
Right.
And so I think she's trying to distance herself from him at this point. I'm not sure.
I thought the irony of it in light of particularly the next piece, the next review we read on French existentialism, that there does seem to be an element of the absurd that she's pointing out that he sort of either foolishly got himself into or not. You know, maybe a larger absurdity. And so it just struck me. I'm sorry that some think it's weird for me to ask that, but that was my question. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's not weird. I just, you know, and I'm not sure. I mean, what is the comic aspect? I assume it's his enter into the Nazi party and, you know, his denial of Husserl a chair and the rumor that he placed himself at disposal of the French occupational authorities for re-education of the German people. I don't know where she got that rumor. It's something that I've not heard elsewhere, but so I don't know how true it is. But in any case, I'm not sure. I just don't know really, Margaret, what to make of this, the comic aspect. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I think she sees it as a kind of, to some degree, potential theater of absurd, but not in the sense of absurdity, I think, in Camus or Sartre's terms, but that we would laugh at such a charlatan if it weren't for the fact that he was actually, you know, really important, and that he actually represents, as she puts here, a trend in German philosophy, namely Romanticism. But I just don't have much to say about it. I just don't know.
No, I was commenting, there was a comment in the chat criticizing this discussion, and I'm sorry, but that
criticizing which discussion?
You know, I'm entitled to ask my question. Other people are entitled to ask theirs. So
yeah, no, you're absolutely. What discussion was being criticized?
that apparently this is divorced from reality, and I don't, so I find it very un-Arendtian that someone feels that they get to tell me what reality is.
Yeah, I don't know what, I don't,
Anyway, I'm done venting. Next.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the chat.
No. I'm just, that's why I made the comment before.
Yeah. So I'm sorry that, let's try and not have those kind of comments in the chat. To the extent, we're all here trying to figure this out. And I certainly don't think I think it's a perfectly legitimate question. I just don't know the answer to it. So let's all do our best to, I'll look for that later. Bill, you're up. Still here, Bill?
I see. Can you hear me, Roger?
Yeah. Hi, Bill.
Yeah. Well, fascinating as always. I was just wondering, today reading, I didn't, quickly reading the French Existential one, I had a strange deja vu going back to university in the early 70s, and even then it was belated, this notion of existentialism. But words like absurd, are they still useful to us in our discussion right now? Maybe I have lost, I'm not sure if absurd is related to what the other participant was just saying about the word comic, how it was sort of like philosophy speak of mid-20th century. It was, to use very tired, but I know some people roll their eyes. It seemed very privileged. It seemed kind of like, what do you mean life is absurd? If you're a mother somewhere trying to feed kids who are starving, if you were a Black person living under Jim Crow and you say that the world is absurd, well, I think it's cruel, it's a lot of things, but absurd seems ridiculous and superficial. And I was just wondering how we got from Husserl to this notion of the absurd. And is there any value at all in labeling aspects of life as absurd, and therefore they are to be discounted? Maybe I'm missing something, Rob. You want to take up that word? Is the word absurd, does it still have currency now in philosophical discussion?
It's a real provocative question. And so think about the word absurd and other words that in these essays are used as a synonym with it to some degree. Degree. Homelessness, abandonment, the loss of a bond between thought and reality. Homelessness, abandonment, and loss, are all words that I would say are negative and provide a sense of loss or decline in some way, or really something's missing. Whereas absurdity is embraced to a certain extent because it offers a kind of who cares, a playfulness aspect to it. And I think there's at least in Sartre, Camus is I think a harder case for me, but at least in someone like Sartre, I think this is one of the reasons Arendt rebels against Sartre or doesn't love him, because she sees it as this kind of playfulness whereas I don't think absurd is a word Arendt would use, and it's not a word I particularly like because it makes it seem as if this is all a game. It takes it out of the of a context in which, again, they are writing not about African Americans under Jim Crow or women in a world of patriarchy. They are writing about largely bourgeois, people, French people, who, are rebelling against sort of the malaise, the boredom, the rigor of modern bourgeois life.
And it's tiresome and a little embarrassing because I feel like they had I don't know, something about that. When I'm reading Hannah Arendt right now, I think what I feel I get the most nourishment from is when her analysis of totalitarianism. She's really in there with me. If we are in a quote revolutionary moment, not in a revolution, I like to hear someone say that. So then I can think, oh, I have to behave differently. And then I begin to look around, how should I behave? I think that the reason she thought so highly, even though she didn't consider herself a philosopher, but she thought so highly of philosophy, was somehow philosophy is supposed to help us live, right? Isn't that the whole question of the Dasein, the being, and all those things, which are, sometimes it's almost laughable, that these people, you're just masturbation, or what is this? So, I mean, make me a believer. Why should I care what Sartre and Camus were saying about reality in the first part of the middle of the 20th century? Why should I care?
Well, you're putting me on a spot because I'm not someone who cares that much. I don't run the Camus Center or the Sartre Center. I enjoy Camus' work. I do, but not. I don't find it to move me the way Arendt's work moves me. Just to use an example. I'll go back to something I said at the very beginning of the session today. These three pieces that we're reading, as have many of the pieces the last 2 or 3 weeks, are book reviews, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are. Hannah Arendt is an emigre, refugee in this country, and she's trying to make a living, and she's writing book reviews that she's getting paid for. And so, this is not to excuse that we're reading them. I think there's something to be gotten out of each one of them. But I don't think this is, these are works in which, the fullness of her thinking is going to come through. Starting in the next 2 or 3 essays, we leave the book review section and we have her now writing her own work. We move to the 1950s. Most of the essays coming up sooner from after 1950. And that's when she's written a book, she's become famous, and now she's writing her own things. And I think you'll see a massive change in the tone of what we're reading. This is.
Roger, let me jump in and be rude here. I just saw someone wrote, Hannah Arendt is writing about existentialism. Why should I care about existentialism right now?
Okay, so that's great. The reason, and that's what I think is the important question. For her, the reason to care about existentialism is that it is based in something real. And that real thing that it's based in is the failure of the philosophic project, the rationalist project, the Christian or religious project, and the scientific project. What those 4 projects all sought to do is make reality comprehensible, make individuals and reality comprehensible, to make, as Hegel said it, to make the real spiritual or ideal or rational. He says all 3. And so much of Arendt's philosophy, whatever you want to call it, thinking, comes from her conviction that the Hegelian project has failed. Namely, that we can no longer write in the spirit of trying to make the world rational. Because that project has failed, and it is fated to fail. And so existentialism matters because you have a series of philosophers from Kant to, Jaspers with Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and in between, who recognize the problem and are struggling to think it through. I think that's why it matters, because it is a problem, and it should make us suspicious of any scientific philosophy. It should make us suspicious of any claims that we can, as both Paul and David were suggesting, and again, perfectly reasonable, but I think Arendt would say would make us suspicious of people who claim we can create a utopia, that we can build a system that will free us from domination. She just doesn't think these things will work. And as a post-metaphysical, post-rationalist, post-scientific philosopher or thinker, that's deeply important to her attempt to address reality and the problems of reality.
Roger, I have this ongoing, I'll get off this last one. I have this ongoing thought experiment. I'm a theater person. I'm looking at the streets in Portland on fire.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to pull this group of people together and get their attention. And I'm going to say that there is something that you really should be paying attention to in the writings of Hannah Arendt. This is the last of it. What is it that Hannah Arendt would say to those people that is urgent right now?
Well, I think one thing she would say is that in order to bring about a revolution, you need to do a little more thinking about what you want. You and I did a project a couple of years ago, Bill, called Radical Vision.
Yes.
Where we tried to say, well, we need a vision. As I'm starting to organize a series right now about what ideal, what should we be fighting for? A lot of us know what we're fighting against, but we don't know what we're fighting for. And so this is an Arendtian insight. And I think she would say, one thing she would say is you should know what you're fighting for, not just what you're fighting against. Another thing she would say is that while violence can be useful at times, it generally doesn't work in politics, and it leads to more violence, not to what you want. And then, so those are, I think, and then the third thing she might say is that civil disobedience is an American ideal, and we should always hold on to that and never give it up. But it should be civil disobedience, not violent disobedience.
Thank you. I've taken up a lot of time. Thank you very much. It's a good answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Bob, you're up.
Okay, am I coming through?
Yep.
I'm trying to explore this idea, this definition of existentialism as the harmony of being and thought. That's what that's her definition, right?
Well, existentialism emerges out of the felt loss of the harmony of being and thought. Now, some of the existentialists, she says, then try and bring magic back in to reunify them. But the essential thought of existentialism is actually the rejection of the harmony of being and thought. It's the rejection of Parmenides. It's the insight that we no longer have that harmony.
Okay, well, where I'm going with this is her later essays on Heidegger and Brecht, in which she does distinguish between their work as artists or philosophers and their life. Yeah. Heidegger was a world-class cad, and Brecht was at best a fool, a political fool. So, here she's distinguishing between it, and yet I thought she was maybe bemoaning the loss of the harmony of being and thought.
I don't think so. I mean, I think for Arendt, the loss of the harmony between being and thought is what opens up the possibility for something new to enter the world. A politics free from um, uh, domination. I mean, to go back in a very different way, I think, to the opening question from Paul, or one of the opening questions from Paul, it's a politics in which we actually have to talk to each other. And this is where Jaspers is so important for Hannah Arendt. Her idea of existentialism, very much like Jaspers, is one of where there's no harmony, there's no reconciliation of reality and ideals, of the world and ideas. And we have to muddle through. And we muddle through by talking to each other and trying to persuade each other of how we should be doing it. And that's what she sees politics as. So yeah, I think now within this, there are going to be moments in which some idea is introduced in the world through a work of art or through a speech or through an act that is going to create kind of moments of unity and maybe even authority, but they're not going to last very long. And so for her, in this existential age, we have to accept the loss of that harmony and somehow try and build political solidarities without it. I take that to be her approach.
Then is the implication that authenticity, or the striving for authenticity, a fool's errand?
Yes, for sure. And more so, a dangerous fool's errand.
And of course, Heidegger was the one who was seeking to define or achieve authenticity, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's different ways to read Heidegger, but certainly in one way of reading him, absolutely. And at times she focuses on that aspect of Heidegger, and at times she focuses on the sort of thoughtful, deconstructive aspect of Heidegger that avoids all authenticities. But yes, you're right in principle.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Fran.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I want to understand the little things, and that are being discussed in the beginning of like the existentialism article. And I think it's kind of like maybe relating a little bit to what Paul and David were trying to say about domination, because what is Hannah Arendt's relationship to the little things that she has described in Hofmannsthal or Husserl? And what is her relationship to unpretentious words or unpretentious little things? I had a feeling that there was a little bit of like belittling on her side towards that. And I want to know if like a tenderness towards the world is something that makes sense to her. If like a tenderness towards the world could also be like a revolutionary idea, for example.
Great, thanks, Fran. So the little things is a phrase of Hofmannsthal, and I'll perfectly admit I have not read Hofmannsthal. She compares it to the things themselves of Husserl, which I have some understanding level, not great. I think again, the way I understand it is that to look at the thing themselves is to go back to what I was just saying with Bill and with Bob even. Take the thing. Let's just use an example. Take the tree. You look outside, you see a tree. What is the tree? Is it part of an ecosystem? Is it part of, is it created by God? Is it, planted by someone? And as a scientist or as a theologian, we can put it in all these systems. She thinks that the mantra to the things themselves, in its negative sense, which is its positive sense, frees us from these attempts to say what the tree is. And we just look at the tree as that. And so to that extent, your offering of an idea of a kind of empathy or warmness to the tree is, I think, apt and works. It's to say, think of it now not as trees, but think of it as refugees, right? Or think of it as, we'll use refugees because she writes about them. To the extent we see refugees as part of a world movement that are understandable according to rules and laws, we lose sight of the individual. Whereas for her, we actually need to listen to the individual refugee. We need to not see them as superfluous, not see them as hordes, and remember that they are each individual people. And she worries with Husserl, and I guess also with Hofmannsthal, that even though they talk about the things themselves or the little things, they always sort of are trying to reanimate a magic that would take us away from the little things and put them back within systems. And that's her criticism of Husserl and Hofmannsthal there. She wants to focus on the individual, to give it a kind of dignity and humanity on its own, outside of any historical determinism or cultural determinism or natural law or anything like that. Whether she's, wants to say we should, was the word used empathy? Is that the word you used, Fran?
Empathy? No, I didn't use that word.
What word did you use to say how we should?
Tenderness towards the world.
Tenderness. Yeah, it's a fascinating. She doesn't talk about tenderness, not that I can ever remember, which is revealing. And I like your use of it. Where I think she would, what I think, again, I'm just trying to put myself in her to the extent I can. What she would say is, to think is not to feel from the perspective of the other, but it's to think from the perspective of the other, to understand them. Now, there's maybe a kind of tenderness that is needed for understanding from the perspective of the other, but there's also a kind of coldness and hardness in which you're not supposed to feel from them. You're supposed to think what they're thinking and think from their perspective. And that's very Arendtian, I think, in its coldness, maybe. I could be wrong. We have to reach out to them, but reach out to them as thoughtfully, not tenderly, as she puts it. She says not empathetically, but thoughtfully. So that's why I sort of switched tenderness and empathy. Why are you, what, can you say more about why you're asking the question?
Yes, because I would like to understand if there are things, and all things can be considered, all things can be thought, why are there little things? And why only big deeds make it into history, for example. The second kind of like question that I have or had in this section was that she said she doesn't believe in magic, for example. She is very suspicious of this idea of magic. But then I think like the idea of wonder, for example, is like something that she does and that she wants to encourage in other people. But then I feel if you're only going to wonder, that is only going that far. Don't you also have to kind of like embrace the magic, which in this case would be the unknowable, I guess.
Yeah, well, for her, wonder, remember, is citing Plato, the origin of philosophy. And in some sense, what she's arguing here is that we have to protect ourselves against philosophy. Insofar as philosophy seeks to respond to wonder by providing answers and theories and magic. And so I don't think she's here giving up on the idea of wonder, but she is saying that wonder has for a long time led to philosophy, and now we need to give up on philosophy. Insofar as philosophy is an attempt to provide solutions or answers and theories and systems to these questions. As for the little things, I mean, I don't think she's opposing little things and big things. She's just, I think those are words that she quotes from Hofmannsthal. And again, I haven't read Hofmannsthal, so I don't know exactly how she's using it. But I think she's simply trying to say little things is a way of talking about things separated from historical, natural laws, individual things cut off, homeless.
Isn't that a possibility that things happen outside the laws of history? Or
well, that's what she's affirming, but she's saying that his philosophy always wants to explain everything, and insofar as it explains everything, it wants to keep it inside. And she's saying no. And so she's saying the little things, or the things themselves, offer the gesture to not to being outside, but that Husserl and Hofmannsthal want to then somehow bring them back in. And that's what she's objecting to. Okay?
I got it for a moment and now I'm lost again. It's fine. I'll.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No worries. We'll get back to it another time. Benjamin.
Okay.
Benjamin?
Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
Sorry, I just had to unmute there. So being definitely like amateur at best at philosophy, this question, like I wonder if the answer to this question isn't like, yes, that's kind of the point of philosophy. But if Arendt believes that there's sort of an already, a not yet coming, something which is to be coming, I was wondering first if, in her opinion, that's going to require some other kind of like ism. I know she's talked about that being the source of like new stabilities. And is it required, first off, that we have one of those? And second off, that like if we're in one, then that's the same as putting up some new banisters. Like that's a population's way of sort of protecting itself from, I guess, the existential terror of not having banisters in some way. And if that's the case, is that not like a very, I guess, very pessimistic way of looking at the evolution of society? Like, is there a way out for a society to think without banisters rather than, say, individual philosophers? I mean, I guess you would say like we're all kind of forced to do that a little bit, but then the idea is people then turn to, for instance, fascism, like she said, on account of that terror of no banisters, when people are willing to, quote, lie the truth to them or whatever. Like, so does she see another way out, or is the cycle more or less doomed to repeat with like a new ism taking place?
I don't know if she knows or anyone knows.
Okay.
I think she finds some hope in what she calls citizen assemblies, right? Workers' councils, local governments. She finds some hope in the fact that while individuals are often irrational, when people come together and deliberate, they often will hear other views and come to some sort of a common sense solution. Now, this doesn't always happen. Let's be very clear, and that's why she thinks it's important to have multiple different political entities, so that if a few of them make bad decisions, there's others where they can resist them.
Oh, I see.
But she doesn't have a single solution. She doesn't. There's no one ism that she says will solve our problems. If that's the question you're asking, is it possible that at some point the world will be reanimated and we'll have a new religion? Absolutely. It's not. It's wildly possible. But she's not. Certainly, she and I have no idea what that would be, and I'm not sort of sitting here waiting for it.
Sure. No, I really liked, though, I guess I had forgotten that the one element in there, though, which was like potentially the hope would be then not in that there will be some new coming ism that everyone agrees to sort of put up the same banisters, right? Because obviously that's very vulnerable to the kind of exploitation you saw with fascism, communism, et cetera. But the idea of that plurality of the ability to hear anybody, I guess, speak, as she said, was like, the fundamental right to speak and to actualize, to illuminate sort of your ideas, like the exposure to different ideas and maybe a vulnerability to them too, might be sort of the solution to that. Then to not go back, like you wouldn't completely remove all banisters from your thought, but you would see lots of people thinking in lots of different ways, and that might act as a bit of a counter to the more extreme kind of unified thinking, which can lead to these horrific excesses. Might be an element of hope for the future in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, sure. Again.
Great. We have a couple more questions, and we're sort of at the time. John, Stephen, and Anita, you want to quickly maybe give yourself a minute each, if I can, to ask a quick question, and then I'll see what I can do.
Sure. Thank you. I'm struggling with page 168, particularly the phrases, if being and thinking are no longer the same, and the nature of things has nothing to do with their reality. And I wonder if you could elaborate.
Yes. So being and thinking are no longer the same. Again, comes from the quote from Parmenides that I've mentioned a couple times, Togar eine, noein, and essay. I'm sorry. I'm speaking Latin and Greek. But anyway, that being and thinking are the same, according to Parmenides. And her claim here is that the entire history of philosophy has been an attempt to say that being and thinking are the same, that there's a reconciliation, that the world and reality is rational. And that has led, she thinks, to a a mistrust of people and a mistrust of individuals, and thus a rejection of freedom, because anyone who's different is said to be irrational. And so she says that not only she rejected, she says that modern philosophy, starting with Kant, has come to reject this identity of freedom and of being and thinking. And the result is that there's a kind of abandonment or homelessness, an openness in which we can actually look at individuals on their own, outside of a kind of a systematic, rational, or scientific logical schema. So that we no longer have to imagine that politics and that the world is subsidiary to philosophy, right? In a sense, to say that thinking and being are the same elevates philosophy over the world and says that those who think govern the world. Arendt rejects that and says that that no longer can happen. Now, now we can no longer reject actions and define and govern the world simply by thought. And so we have to actually look at the world in its plurality and its uniqueness, and look at each thing on its own and put them in conversation without the hope of reconciling them into one scientific or rational unity.
The other piece of, thank you, the other piece of my confusion is the phrase, the nature of things has nothing to do with reality. Then science can be whatever it likes.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Reality exceeds the essence or nature of things.
Isn't that contradictory?
To what?
If the nature of a thing isn't that its reality, how do you reject what you are?
No, well, I mean, when she says the nature of things, she's talking about it in a philosophical sense, like its essence. And what she's saying is that your essence doesn't define who you are. That's the claim of existentialism, is that there is no essence that can capture who you are.
Thank you. That's okay.
Yeah, look, like I said in the answer to Bill earlier, here again, these are book reviews where she's dealing with other people's thinking. Starting in a week or so, we're going to be reading more of her own work, and I think it'll be less jargony and hopefully a little easier to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Stephen, quickly, a minute.
Come on. Okay, thank you very much. A great discussion. Just one question on essay number 2, I guess. Does Arendt think that Jaspers is the culmination of existentialism or an alternative to the other thinkers she deals with, or that he supersedes them? And if so, is it because of his emphasis on conversation? And if that's the case, would Arendt then be happy to call herself a philosopher if the only true philosopher is the one who deals in conversation? She seems to be reluctant to label herself with that, but she does seem to have a kind of concept of what an ideal philosopher would be. And it seems to me that Jaspers is sort of fitting that bill. Would you have a comment on that, Roger?
Well, I think it's generally right. I mean, I think she sees Jaspers as, of all of these philosophers, he's the one she's most associating herself with.
Yeah.
That's clearly the case. Yeah. And for the reasons you said, which is that he responds to the abandonment of being, of reality by being, the sort of break between them, without an attempt to reunify them, but an attempt to put them in conversation. And And that is, I think, in many ways, the approach that Arendt takes in her own work. So whether she's a philosopher or not, I mean, that's a question that we can, it just doesn't matter to me. But okay, if you want to call her a philosopher in that sense, fine.
Got it. Okay.
All right. Anita, you're up. Last question. Keep it short, please.
Okay, I will do. Running through all of the essays we've read, or a lot of the essays, is this dissatisfaction. Sorry, it's buzzing. I'll write it because my PC is making.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Anita. I don't know why that's happening. It happened last week too. If you write it, I'll see if I can answer it. Okay. She may write it and I'll answer it, but thank you all. For next week, like I said, we're going to get into some of her own writing, especially with the image of hell. I think we're also reading The Nation. I'm not sure, but enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and have a great week, and we'll see you next Friday. Thank you all very much. And I'm still going to try and answer Anita's question if she writes it down.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Roger.
everyone.
See you all. Cheers.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see there's more conversation about the communism and Marxism question. Yeah. I'll have to look,
Will the chat get saved, or do I have to save it?
we don't save the chats, so if you want to save any particular part of it, you can.
I see a little tab that says file. Would that save the chat? Oh no, that's for me to attach a file.
Actually, if you
Save the chat.
the dots next to the file,
Yeah,
will give you an opportunity to save chat.
Where is it saved to if you save it?
It's saved to a file on your computer.
Oh.
I think it says Zoom dot something or other, and you it's I think that it creates its own Zoom folder.
I think it usually called chat.meeting.txt, and after you save it, ask it to show it to you in the Finder. There should be an option that comes up for that.
Yep.
Then that way, rename it something you can then find easily again, because also every chat you save will have automatically the same name. So you may accidentally save over one if you're not careful.
It appeared just as you said. Thank you.
So Anita, you wrote, through Arendt's work, there's a skepticism about rationality and the failure of the Enlightenment project. Why does she think it has survived? Largely because we haven't come up with something new. And people are afraid of the void. I think that's the answer. You're not going to move on until we have something to move on to. That's the question of what are we fighting for. So that would be why it's still here. I mean, again, she's not skeptical of it in the sense that she doesn't like enlightenment. She just doesn't think a rationalization of the world in a Hegelian sense is going to work. But generally, the Enlightenment she's quite positive about in the sense of freeing us from authorities. That she's not negative on at all. I mean, she's not fully anti-Enlightenment, or I wouldn't put her in that camp. Okay. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.